I'm Jeff Wilson. I'm the president and CEO of Precipitate Gold Corporation. Precipitate is a junior gold exploration company focused on assets in both the Dominican Republic and Newfoundland, Canada.
Jeff, good to see you again. In fact, nice end of year roundup time. I'm dressed like Christmas, so let's go. Right, I think we had lots of questions sent in on various platforms, and it's kind of quite clear to me that I think some people would very much like to be able to work out and attribute some kind of value to the Dominican Republic assets. Okay, so you did that deal earlier in the year with Barrick, $5 million plus 3% NSR on Pueblo Viejo, sorry, their Pueblo Viejo and your project and Pueblo Grande to kind of come together. So, what can you tell us as to what Barrick's intentions are, and what are they actually doing on the ground?
Yeah, Barrick is still under an earn-in agreement whereby they, in order to earn a 70% interest in our Pueblo Grande project, which, as you mentioned, essentially surrounds their Pueblo Viejo mine site, they've got to spend $10 million US over 6 years and provide or produce a pre-feasibility study at the end of that 6-year term. That's a pretty aggressive spend and commitment in a relatively short amount of time for any major company to get to pre-feas. So we're pleased with that. That keeps them honest. In the interim, there are annual thresholds that they've got to spend a certain amount of money each year of the agreement. So our expectation is that Barrick is going to fulfill the current year's obligations, which would be to spend an additional $1.5 million between now and the spring of next year. And we expect that to include some drilling. Now, again, we're awaiting some full details from Barrick on what they plan to execute, but all indications are that they are full speed ahead on fulfilling the current obligations of that agreement and continuing to explore the project and move things forward.
Okay, so $10 million, a minimum of 7,500 meters plus a PFS by the end of a 6-year period with various stages to that. So I think people can look that up. I recognize you can't say too much because it's an agreement with another party. They may have their own stipulations as part of that agreement. But as far as you're concerned, I like that phrase, kind of keep them honest, so that they kind of keep. And by the way, does that money have to be spent on drilling, or is it because it's there hasn't been much work done on that property? Can they spend that on a multitude of different ways?
They can spend it in multiple different ways. The only the only stipulation was the minimum meterage in terms of drilling at 7,500 meters, but outside of that, it can be spent in any manner. Now, what's I think doesn't really relate in the numbers of the agreement is that $10 million US. But by all accounts, anybody I've spoken to who's worked with or for major mining companies has evidence to me that, look, there's no way you get a project to a pre-feasibility stage without spending significantly more than 10 million. So we're comfortable that if in fact they take this all the way to the full extent of the agreement and execute on earning a 70%, the project will see a significant amount more than $10 million spent on it by Barrick, and getting anything to a point where Barrick wants to take it to a pre-feasibility stage would indicate that there's something fairly meaningful there. And for us to have a 30% interest in that is, I think, of great value. Perhaps more importantly, I'm not sure that Barrick wants to have Precipitate as a partner, holding hands, dancing off into the sunset. So there may be some leverage there for Precipitate if at such time there's a 70-30 agreement in front of us.
Right, and it's obviously, like, for a company your size, you've kind of got to do the dance, right? You've got to work out where the next money's coming through without being dilutive to shareholders, and they would want that of you. But just in terms of, it can come back to that value component, which is there's a 3% NSR, which can be sold off at some point, presumably, should you wish to. There is the 30% component post PFS, delivery of a PFS, after which point you would then have to meet your own, or your own share of whatever works through a feasibility study. Is that right?
Actually, no. We were able to work out an agreement whereby, in the agreement, whereby if we get to a 70-30%, we have the right to call upon Barrick to arrange our 30%. And that money is then paid back out of production or operations. So we're again, I think it's a nice position for us to not get to a point where they deliver this incredible Cadillac pre-feasibility or feasibility study and say, oh, by the way, little Precipitate, your 30% interest is going to cost you hundreds of millions of dollars. Good luck with that. we've got the ability to protect against that sort of unnecessary dilution down to, say, an NSR by calling upon Barrick to arrange that financing for us.
Right. So that's really clear. So that has real value. If you didn't do another thing, that has real value.
Yep.
Okay. And then it's really just a question of timing. How long are shareholders waiting for you for the company to be able to kind of monetize that? But are there any components which you can bring forward? Like, do Barrick have an option, or would they, do you think, want to take the 30% out at the, sooner rather than later?
Well, I think that would come down to, that would just become a strategy thing. If they started to see some things in their exploration results that were giving them joy, and they thought, hey, this thing has the potential to be bigger and better than we'd ever hoped, maybe before we get all the way along, why don't we start talking to our friends here and see, how we can execute something that works for
right.
everybody.
Right. To be able to kind of execute on some or all of that 30%. Okay.
Yeah.
So those are the sorts of options on the table, and you don't have to. It would be what suits your strategy as a company going forward. Okay. I just want to kind of make it clear, because lots of new people looking in here, and they're asking some quite, good questions and some simple questions, but sometimes the simple ones are the best ones. Right. Are we good with Dominican Republic? I think we are. Unless is there any updates on Ponton or Juan de Herrera?
No, the only thing I can say there is that in recent months, I have been down to the Dominican Republic, meeting with some of the government officials, and the other sort of, question mark with respect to our DR assets is, our neighbor Gold Quest with their Romero project, and will that get its exploitation permit to be able to push forward? We continue to sort of help push that forward for them. We want to see our neighbors get the green light so that, it sort of opens up the door for all of us to continue spending money and working there. I think one of the things that's changed for us as it relates to Juan de Herrera is that we always have had all of our permits and all of our concession rights, and we're fully able, should we wish to move forward at Juan de Herrera and Ponton. We've sort of strategically decided that better return on investment there will come after our neighbors have an exploitation permit and there's some clarity of path forward. But one of the things that this Barrick transaction earlier in the year, back in May, did for us by putting $5 million US, or about $6.5 million Canadian in the treasury, is we're equipped at any point in time, without having to go back to the market, without having to raise money, should we deem it beneficial and accretive to go back and spend money on those assets. We own drills, we have permits, and so really it's a matter of sort of a kind of a political climate thing that we're sort of waiting out. And if it's time to turn those taps back on, we're not starting from a standstill and saying, okay, the environment's better, maybe our share price has ticked up a bit, let's raise money to go drilling there. We're fully equipped to do that at the drop of a hat. And I think that, yes, that may still take some time to work out, but I think being in a position of strength on all fronts there, I think, is good for us as well.
Okay, I kind of get the optionality bit there. Now, I do want to talk about the 5 million and what you've been doing with it and what you're going to continue doing with it in a second up in Newfoundland. But just on the point of waiting out the political climate thing, again, just responding to kind of questions sent in, again, just to help people with the understanding is, Gold Quest have filed an arbitration, apparently. Have you, one, is that true? And two, is there any intent on your part to kind of join in on that one, just kind of jog the government along, or is it best to kind of just sit back and wait these things out?
Yeah, I think I'm not aware that anything has in fact been filed. I think it's been threatened. Maybe it's been filed, and I'm not aware that could be. We've not been asked by Gold Quest to align in anything like that. So we'll see. I think the little nuance to this that's important is that we keep talking, and I'm guilty of this sometimes myself too. We talk about this as being a political thing. To some extent it is, but really it's not as if we're up against a government that doesn't believe in or doesn't want mining. We've just talked about Barrick and its Pueblo Viejo. It's one of the top 5 largest gold mines on the planet. The Dominican government relies on mining, understands mining, believes in mining. So this is not a jurisdiction that is saying we don't want mining in our backyard. What they're saying is there's some people in the local community that are obstructing this, and you need to get that local community on side in order for us as politicians to get all the praise rather than the criticism for approving this thing. And I think that's not a Dominican issue. That happens in any part of the world we need to address the local concerns. So I do like to clarify that this is not as if this is some president or government that just outright doesn't want mining. They want mining to exist somewhat harmoniously with, the agricultural industries and other parts of the community, such that, again, as politicians, they want to be popular. So how do we make this decision? How do we grant these rights in a way that keeps us popular and hopefully gets us reelected? That's what they're thinking, not we don't want mining. And I think that's a important point to make.
Fair point. Fair point. Yep, and we do hear that a lot most days, quite frankly. In other jurisdictions all across the world. Well, look, Jeff, let's trot up to Canada, to the homeland, Newfoundland. You put out a piece with regards to the completion of the 2,700 meter drill program at Motherlode Gold Project. Tell us what you now know.
Yeah, I mean, that went very well. I mean, we marched that project from an acquisition about a little over a year ago to a first phase of drilling for us here in recent months. Again, smoothness of getting the project drill ready, getting permitting. Speaking about permitting, we were able to expedite that process pretty nicely in Newfoundland, and the weather behaved pretty well for us, and we were able to get that done through late fall and into sort of November. As you mentioned, we got 2,700 meters of drilling completed, which was the target objective in about 12 holes. Relatively shallow depth. Most holes were sort of 200 to 300 meters depth, so we're targeting a relatively shallow target here. But one of the holes did target a slightly deeper chargeability anomaly that we identified through the ground geophysics, so the IP, induced polarization program that we did. And so seeing that high chargeability at depth, what we noticed there was it was situated directly beneath surface mineralization, an area where grab samples and rock samples had returned over 25 grams per ton gold. So some pretty rich mineralized outcropping. But prior operators had never drilled into this chargeability anomaly that we identified at depth. So yeah, there had been some prior drilling in the area, but we, through this new IP survey, evidenced a body, if you will, that had not been previously intersected with drilling. So, our drilling targeted this for the first time. We sort of like some of what we see in some of the holes visually. I mean, not that I'm seeing visual gold or any of that kind of stuff, but just it looks as if it's the right stuff. And all of that material has now been submitted to the labs for analysis, and we'll see sometime in Q1 of 2023 what those assay results look like, and that'll determine what we do next.
Right. So let's kind of try and put that in English for most people, because I'm just very conscious there's a kind of big audience who've come from outside mining, perhaps not quite sure what the vocabulary and the words are. So we and I know I appreciate it's not very technical, but for those coming in new, it will sound that way. It will sound baffling, and I don't want them trotting off somewhere else. So you've done all of the above. What does that mean you do now? What is the opportunity ahead of you that you're going to try and reveal?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sequenced process, if you will, in that we try to take steps being fiscally responsible. So you try to do the low-hanging fruit, the simplest, least expensive methodology. That often is groundwork, surface work, sampling, collecting soil samples, rock samples to see, hey, is there some form of mineralization here in this area that we don't see elsewhere? And we did see that. We were able to do some airborne geophysics, so flying helicopters over and getting some magnetic readings from that. Again, we saw some anomalous zones that were situated in the same areas where we were getting gold at surface. And then we went down and ran along the ground, essentially large cables that you run across, hundreds of meters, if not kilometers. You inject a charge into the ground, and you get a response from that charge as to how well the subsurface is holding that charge. And if it's holding that charge, it's conductive. It's telling you that there's some material in the rock that has the potential to host sulfides, which often is where gold exists. So it's these sort of scientific methods that sort of vector you towards an area that you think could be the most prospective for hosting gold. And then the final sort of acid test is drilling and getting those assay readings about that. So that's where we sit now, is waiting on the assays to come back to sort of further answer your question. What do we do next? Those assays will tell us, okay, if certain bodies within that geophysical anomaly do in fact hold gold, well, there's more of that body for us to test, and we can start to step out along strike and contiguously evidence, does this chargeable body continue, and does the gold within it continue? Should we identify some gold? So it's at this point it's a wait and see what the analysis tells us about the work that we've done to date. If we get a proof of concept, really that's what it's about. Proof of concept will allow us to then continue on with more of the same kind of work along strike.
Right. Okay. So it's really clear to, again, people looking in at this, listening to this for the first time, and your current shareholders, I guess, is the focus is on Motherlode. You talked about you have the optionality with the money you received back in May to go back into Dominican Republic on the various projects should you wish to. But the reality is Newfoundland is the focus. So how much of the money have you got left, and what will it allow you to do?
Yeah, so we're sitting on approximately $7 million Canadian right now in the Treasury. We did raise some flow-through money late last year that has now essentially been deployed into Canada and Newfoundland. That was money raised at higher prices, at a premium because of the flow-through component. So we're sitting on about $7 million now, mostly hard dollars. Money that we have discretion on. We didn't touch on this, but our assets in the Dominican Republic are owned 100%. There's no underlying option payments that we're coming up against. There's no work commitment obligations. So fully discretionary in terms of that treasury. And so I think what we do next will be dictated in part by the results from Motherlode, but also we've been spending a great portion of the last 6 months or so looking at new opportunities, new ideas. How can we leverage that cash into something better than simply depleting it, month after month, day after day, as you stay alive as a publicly listed entity, and do something transformational or accretive? And so we've been looking at a lot of new asset opportunities, merger and acquisition type possibilities. In this market, as I'm sure you and your viewers can appreciate, there's no shortage of people who look at a company like ours with $7 million cash and say, hey, how can we work together? And so it isn't what I really have found over the last few months is it's not just it's good companies with good people and good projects that have still sort of found themselves in challenging financial situations. And so it's not an indictment on the management team in every case or the quality of the assets. Sometimes it's just been circumstantial. We've been in a tough market where access to additional capital and the timing of that has been challenging. And so there's some really good possibilities out there that we're looking at. But again, we're in this fortunate, favorable position where we don't have to acquire anything. We've got a portfolio that we like. We've got assay results pending. We've got work being conducted by our partners at Barrick that's not costing us anything. And so we're in a position where we can be selective. But if we see something we like and we want to execute, I think we're in a good position to be able to do that.
Do you think, because obviously everyone piled into Newfoundland, a couple of years ago, and quite rightly so, some huge headline numbers coming out of there. I think the shine's come off a lot of those kind of wannabes, and there's a few people kind of delivering it. Do you feel that you made the right move going into Newfoundland? Are you kind of encouraged by what you see there, or do you feel that perhaps the broader story for the company needs another arm to it, as it were? Another geography.
Good question. I'm pleased with how Newfoundland has played out for us so far. Let's call a spade a spade. Part of the reason why we went there is we were sort of handcuffed a little bit with the Dominican Republic, and we couldn't justify to junior mining investors to sit around and say the story here is wait, mañana. That's not going to cut it. We had to do something where we were, moving things forward. And so Newfoundland presented for us an area where we liked the geology, we liked the ability to access capital, and we liked the jurisdiction with respect to policies and timelines and that sort of thing. So it delivered for us on all fronts. It has to date. The only thing we're still not sure of is whether or not Motherlode is going to deliver gold mineralization in the assays. But yeah, no, I'm content with the jurisdiction and with the asset that we picked up there. We didn't go into sort of the hot area in and around Newfound Gold. We're in a region that's, unto itself, if you will. It's a different geological district. So we're not sort of ambulance chasing in that regard. Having said all of that, we are not looking exclusively now for new assets in Newfoundland. We're not necessarily looking to expand our presence in that province. We're really looking at everything independently, and it may be a gold asset, it may be a copper asset, it may be in Canada, it may be in the U.S. So, really looking at what we really feel sort of fits our skill set, and is something that we can add value to, and maybe some uncovered or unidentified opportunity that we can bring that the current owner hasn't been able to accomplish.
Interesting. Really interesting, actually. You make me think though, because a couple of things that you've talked about. You've talked about, obviously, okay, it's not a political game per se in Dominican Republic. It's a story that's been oft repeated in every jurisdiction, in every country around the world. When it comes to miners, you kind of got to get the local social license and all of those wonderful things attached to that, as well as the permitting and licensing side of things. Are there jurisdictions now that you think perhaps, because you talk about, and we maybe look down in the US, I'm like, some of the stories I'm hearing out of the US are seemingly very, very difficult place to do mining. Whatever the politicians say with regards to battery metals, whatever they say in terms of being pro-business. And, it just strikes me that it's very hard to actually confidently go into any jurisdiction now and think, I think I can get this thing over the line, because
It's a valid point. Definitely the world is shrinking. There's no question about that for us. I think for us, part of it also is where we are domiciled. So here on the west coast of Canada and in British Columbia and in Vancouver specifically, I look at things like, what's it going to cost me? What's it going to cost my team to get to the project frequently? And if we're going halfway around the world, let's say to places like Australia or something like that, wonderful jurisdictions, great places to do business in a lot of different ways. But, what's my, experience at operating in that place? How am I going to find people? How am I going to get, there to spend enough face time with the local politicians and the local landowners? So, it's things like that play into it as well. Sometimes it's not just what's a good jurisdiction, but what's a good jurisdiction for me, my team, and where I'm situated. And so, north-south makes a lot of sense for us. It's much easier for us, without crossing too many time zones, to go down into the U.S. or certain parts of Canada. So that's kind of why I'm looking in those parts of the world. Are there other places we would consider? Absolutely. But there are a lot of different layers to evaluation beyond just the geology or just the rocks, as we're touching on here now.
Okay, so what do the next 6 months look like for you guys?
Yeah, well, we're really excited about the next quarter. Going into 2023, we're hoping to start to get some assay results from the Motherlode drilling. I think that will tell us a lot about where we go next there. Barrick, my expectation is that Barrick is going to start to ramp things up for their next phase of work, and I'm hoping that Q1, maybe Q1, Q2 of next year should be fairly active for them. They've got, as I said, they've got a spring sort of threshold in terms of expenditure to commit to, and I expect them to do that. So I think there'll be a fair bit of work by Barrick on Pueblo Viejo. And outside of that, I guess the two wild cards are, what happens, sort of with Romero, our neighbors at Juan de Herrera, and does that provide a platform for us to get back in there and get aggressive with existing drill permits and drill targets that we have? And lastly, can we execute on something new and bring something else into the fold here that sort of ideally changes kind of the valuation and the dimension of the company going forward? So a couple of, I think, quite, attainable or achievable sort of things here coming forward, assay results and Barrick's work. I think we can count on those things moving forward. And then a couple of wild cards in the form of, do we get some daylight at Juan de Herrera, and can we bring something new into the fold?
Right. Okay. I like that. Well, look, just have a great Christmas. I'm off in a few days. We'll see you hopefully in the new year when some of this stuff starts coming through. Certainly on the assay front, I'd be keen to sort of see what comes back there. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Thanks as always.